Hello, Psych 101. Today's lecture is going to be on Chapter 1, which is the Introduction to Psychology. Most of this lecture will cover the history of psychology, where it started, when it started, where we are today, and then the last part of the lecture will cover the different degrees in psychology that you can get along with the different careers in psychology that most people are in. So when we're face to face, I usually pose this question to the class: when do you think psychology began? And the way I kind of look at it is psychology began the moment humanity began. So the moment we began to think, interact, behave, feel, that's ultimately when psychology began. Then if we look at Aristotle, Plato, the Hellenistic age, around 300 to 450 BC, nurture and nature was a topic that philosophers were debating. Nurture being the environment, nature being biology, heredity, genetics. And oftentimes the debate is which one's more important? Nurture, the environment we're born into, or the environment that surrounds us from birth through childhood, or nature, the genetics or DNA, the biology that's passed on from generation to generation. When we talk about nurture versus nature and we begin to philosophize or even debate or think about which one is more important or which one really impacts us psychologically more than the other, is it nurture, our environment, or nature, the biology, genetics? They both impact our psychological development. It's hard to say which one is more important. I think we could fairly say that they're both equally important. They both can impact us. Maybe nurture is impacting us more at one moment in life. Maybe nature can be impacting more at one point in life. But they're both impactful, and they both affect our psychological growth. Then came Wilhelm Wundt, and this is the beginning of modern psychology. If this is one of the main markers or dates or people. When did psychology begin? Typically, it began with Wilhelm Wundt in the late 19th century. And Wilhelm Wundt is considered the father of modern psychology, and he established the first psychological laboratory in Germany. And he actually created the first major school of psychology called structuralism. Okay, so this was the first major school of thought in psychology. And Wundt and the structuralists, what they were focused on and what they were interested in was understanding our consciousness, or how we consciously experience the world. And as you'll see when I go over these schools of thought, consciousness was a main focus in study and reflection and awareness at the beginning of psychology. And it still is today, but it especially was at the beginning of psychology. And structuralists explored, basically its name of the school of thought, explored the structure, the foundation, or the pieces, the parts, the basic elements that make up our consciousness. And they try to reduce basically consciousness into its simplest parts. Okay, and these are some of the parts, right? Sensations, feelings, images, understanding how those impacted our consciousness. Introspection was a major part of the structuralist movement. And introspection is, if we were to define it, an intensive, unbiased analysis of one's own consciousness. And that's what the structuralists used a lot to gain awareness, to gain understanding, to pursue the field of psychology, to enhance that first school of thought. And introspection, more or less, is self-reflection, right? Reflecting on one's own inner world and one's own thoughts and feelings to gain a better understanding of who we are, to gain a better understanding of self, and also to gain a better understanding, to use that to gain a better understanding of others and the world around us. Okay. observing. Another way of looking at introspection is observing one's own consciousness. So there's always criticisms of any sort of theory or school of thought or movement. And I typically would ask the class, what do you think a criticism would be of structuralism when you look at introspection? And the main criticism is that, introspection is, an unbiased thinking. And ultimately, that's impossible to have 100% of the time. So it could be using introspection as the core foundation of structuralism. It can be too subjective. It's hard to truly be unbiased, right? It leads to a lack of reliability of results. Now, can we be less biased? Like, yes, we're all biased in some degree, but can some of us be less biased and some of us be more biased? Sure. And can we become less biased over time through introspection, through reflection, through interacting with others? Yeah, for sure. That's one of the beauties of reflection and introspection. I'm a big fan of self reflection. It's one of the easiest. No, I shouldn't say easiest, but it's one of it's free. We could do it all the time, but we can get trapped, right? We can get trapped in our biases. We can get trapped in our disorders. We can get trapped in a negative state. So sometimes self-reflection, I think it's a great place to start, but sometimes we need more. Sometimes we need help from others in order to guide our self-reflection into a better state. All right, the second school of thought is called functionalism. And functionalism was created by William James. And William James was also focused on the conscious mind. But instead of understanding the structure, right? Instead of understanding the foundation, which structuralism was focused on, now it was about understanding the function of the mind, the function of the consciousness, and how consciousness, how it can help us adapt to life. All right, next, in the early 20th century came Freud. And, Freud's one of those, major figures in psychology that when most people think of psychology or can remember a component about their Psych 101 class or their, psychology class in high school, Freud is one of those major figures that people can remember. And a lot of Freud's theory, some of Freud's theory is not like highly viewed upon, but there's still a lot of Freud's theory that is useful, even today, especially when we talk about defense mechanisms and communication with our girlfriends, our boyfriends, our husbands, our wives. That's a major part of conflict when we're interacting with others, or when anxiety arises. When we're talking with others, oftentimes our defense mechanisms come in, and then it creates, typically it creates conflict and unable to hear each other, unable to work on our problems, which could lead to worse problems. But Freud created, now, instead of consciousness, one of Freud's big movements, or his movement, was focusing on unconsciousness. Unconscious conflict, and how that creates anxiety and stress in our lives, and how we can develop abnormally or develop disorders because of that. And his main theory was psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theory, and which is still studied today. It's not, from what I found, it's not a lot of therapists out there or psychologists are typically studying psychoanalysis as much, but the theory's still out there. We still learn it. You'll still learn it if you go into a master's program or doctoral program. You'll still learn it, and there's still different different businesses that are training people in it as well, but it's not the most popular school of thought right now. Next came behaviorism, and behaviorism lasted for 30 years or so. And behaviorism is the scientific study of how observable environmental factors affect behavior. And there was this major shift. Behaviorism kind of marked this major shift away from consciousness, away from unconsciousness experiences, because it was deemed too unscientific. It was too subjective, right? And at this time, again, biology and chemistry were gaining popularity, and behaviorism really tried to shift psychology into a scientific focus. This oftentimes was deemed the dark ages of consciousness and unconscious. Because again, a lot of psychologists were unhappy with the lack of progress that structuralism and functionalism provided. These are some of the main behaviorists, these are some of a lot of people have heard of Pavlov or Pavlov dogs. We'll get into that during the learning chapter. Skinner Watson will also get into their theories in the behavior in the learning chapter as well. But these are some of the main behaviorists during the time. And again, one of the main focuses of behaviorism is rejected this idea of consciousness. And it focused on, what can we observe and measure, versus introspection, which is a little loose. Let's dive into the psychological mind. Let's dive into our consciousness. Let's reflect and understand our behavior and the world. Behaviorism shifted away from that towards, no, what can we observe and measure like behavior? And how does the environment affect behavior was a main focus as well. So when we go to the criticism of behavior, one of the main criticism is how can we focus on our visible behavior without understanding our internal or mental process that creates it, right? We can't just focus on behavior because it's driven by the mind. It's driven by the brain. So that was kind of the main criticism of behaviorism. And that kind of led to, the school of thoughts after this. So right after behaviorism came Carl Rogers, who is this man here, and he created positive psychology. And I'm a big fan of Carl Rogers and humanistic psychology. And it was this major shift again from science, what we can observe and measure, versus now it's all about the person. It's all about our ability to. And some of these are keywords like lingo and language from Carl Rogers. And again, he was popular. He popularized the idea of self-actualization, which is ultimately our ability, human beings' ability, your ability, my ability to reach our goals, more or less, to self-actualize our dreams, to create our dreams, to move towards them. We all have that ability to do that. All right. After Carl Rogers came the birth of cognitive psychology, and this was the scientific study of the mental process. So it moved away from still consciousness. It moved away from introspection, and there was, because of behaviorism, now there was this focus on the scientific study of the brain. So not just let's self-reflect, but no, let's understand and study the mental process. Cognitive psychology, we actually have a class here. I teach it every once in a while, Psych 126. It is cognitive psychology, and it focuses on problem solving, decision making. Memory is a big part of cognitive psychology. There's like 5 chapters just on memory. We have a chapter on memory in Psych 101, so we'll get into that. But cognitive psychology really looked at the brain as a computer or a thinking machine. Ulrich Neisser, George Miller, 2 of the founding fathers of cognitive psychology. Now, if we were to define, psychology, what is psychology, right? It's a massive kind of undertaking. There's more than just what I'm about to tell you when we try to define psychology. But more or less, if you go into the textbook, it's a combination of two things: the study of the mind and the brain, and behavior. Okay, it's not just behavior. It's not just about the mind, the brain. It's really the study of both. And that's a very simplistic way to define it. I put it, or how the mental process affects behavior. And then ultimately you can go the same way back, how behavior affects the mental process. All right, now that we're going to get into the history of psychology, that's a brief history. Now I kind of want to talk to you about the different degrees and the careers that are out there. Okay. So this graph, it's a little 3 years old. But I look at this today, and I look at where I am and where my colleagues are, and it's still pretty accurate. Most settings, if you get a degree in psychology, and typically you need a master's degree these days to pursue an actual career in psychology. You don't necessarily need a doctorate. You need a master's, and then you need to get you need to be licensed in a certain field. So it's kind of a two-part process. Most people who get a degree in psychology usually teach at a 4-year college. That's what I do. That's one of the things I do. You can also work for a private company. This could be any sort of counseling center, or any sort of place where that does therapy, or even like psych evaluations. Then there's just self-employed. I kind of am both. I'm a teacher, and I'm also self-employed. I have my own private practice. A lot of therapists will start their own private practice. Some will work in group practices, so they'll work with a bunch of people in an office. But psychology is also known to kind of to work alone. You have your own practice, your own office. So that's a popular thing. You could work for the government, and you can also work for schools, as well. But typically, as a school psychologist, you're not doing these days. You're not doing a lot of therapy as a school psychologist. You're doing a lot of IEPs. You're doing a lot of evaluations, psych evaluations. There's a lot of paperwork in the school settings. Okay, even though most students, the IEPs are important and the evaluations are important, but the therapy is just as important. But that's not there in a lot of schools these days. And then when we look at the different degrees and the different areas of study, these are them, on this pie chart. Okay. And one of the most popular ones is clinical psychology, and it's the most popular because it's the most practical. And clinical psychology deals with studies, assesses, and treats individuals with psychological disorders. And that's one of the main practical careers, is that we're assessing, we're meeting people, meeting clients. We're assessing for any sort of psychological disorder. We're also assessing beyond psychological disorders. We're assessing people's lives. We're getting to know people, and then we're treating them. And treating them typically comes in the form of as a psychologist or a therapist doing therapy with them, talking about their problems, trying to gain awareness, learning different skills for communication, for relaxation. But oftentimes it's talking about our problems and being vulnerable and getting what's upsetting us out into the open, and then starting to work with it. All right, these are just a few of the fields. Again, there's biological psychology, cognitive, neuroscience. This is a very popular one these days. Developmental psychology, personality psychology, social psychology, cultural psychology, clinical psychology, industrial organizational psychology. A lot of these subfields are more academic. The ones that are more practical are clinical psychology. And then industrial and organizational psychology is very popular as well. and that focuses on psychology in the workplace, psychology in the business world, right? How do we get, how does an employer get employees to be the most effective and efficient while also focusing on their personal life, while keeping that into consideration as well. But a lot of these like biological, developmental personalities, social, cultural, those are all academic related. There's not a lot of practical applications yet for those subfields. And then lastly, here are kind of some of the psych careers or where you get a license. So I'm a marriage and family therapist. I'm an LMFT. I needed to get my master's degree. That was the academic part of it. And then there is a practical part of it. You have to become licensed in a certain field to actually start to treat patients, to see patients, for me to be able to kind of hang up my sign and have a private practice. I need to be licensed to be able to do that. So typically in psych careers, just like in most careers, there's an academic part of it, and then there's a practical part of it. There's the internship part of it. There's gaining hours in the field. So these are really the main careers that are out there in the psych world. There's a psychiatrist, and that's an MD. That's a doctor. And as a psychiatrist, the only thing psychiatrists typically do is prescribe psych medication. So medication for the mind. So if someone is diagnosed with some sort of disorder, whether it's depression, whether it's anxiety related or something else, typically one would go to a psychiatrist to talk with them and to get certain medication that is specifically for the mind. You can get psychiatric medication from a regular doctor, from your family doctor, from your pediatrician typically, or and you can get psych meds from your gynecologist as well. But typically I encourage, especially if it's the first time or you're thinking about getting some sort of antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication, some SSRI, if it's the first time, I would typically be referred to a psychiatrist versus your regular doctor, because a psychiatrist, that's what they specialize. They don't specialize on how to treat a broken bone or if you have a virus. They focus on how the depression or how the anxiety is affecting you. So I always encourage to go to a specialist, and a psychiatrist is the only type of doctor that can prescribe you your psych meds. So, and I in the sense that if you were to go to a psychologist or if you would go to a therapist, they can't prescribe you medication. But again, a regular doctor can, and a gynecologist can, and I think there's nothing wrong with that if you know what medication is working and it's working the way you want. There's nothing wrong with that. But if it's not, I would go to a psychiatrist because again, they're the experts in that field. Then there's a psychologist, which is a PhD or a PsyD. A PsyD is typically a PhD, but research-based. Most school psychologists will have a PhD or a PsyD. And a psychologist really, it does the same thing as an LMFT or an LCSW. And an LMFT is a licensed marriage and family therapist. That's what I am. An LCSW is a licensed clinical social worker. All three, the psychologist, LMFT, and LCSW, you can work in the school setting. You can work in mental health, in Department of Mental Health for the county or for the city. You can work at any sort of clinic that does therapy. You can have a private practice. You can teach possibly. But my focus in LMFT, we focus on talk therapy. I'm sitting down with clients, all ages, all different types of problems, and we're talking about the problem. We're getting to, we're getting an awareness of the problem. We're talking about how to shift mindset, how to change behavior, how to be vulnerable, how to work through trauma, all that sort of stuff. But a psychologist, LMFT, LCSW are all very similar in the academic part of it, what's required, and then the practical part of it. You know, most of them will have thousands of, like, you know, for my MFT, I had to do about 3,000 hours of clinical work before I could take the examinations to get my license. And it's very similar to a psychologist, LMFT and LCSW. A psychologist has a little bit more academic parts of it. So you're in school for a little bit longer. But the clinical process, the internship hours after are very similar across all three. And then they all require, you know, 1 to 2, actually more than one, I shouldn't say. They all require, at least right now, and these things can change, but they all require at least 2 state board examinations to pass. Okay. All right. If you have any questions, guys, that's kind of, again, a brief history. Take a look at the textbook. If you know, the textbook will add a little bit more of the history. I focused on kind of what I wanted to focus on, are the most important ones to me. But if you want a little bit more, go into the textbook, take a look. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, feel free to message me through Canvas, and I will answer them. All right. Okay, guys, bye.